The dusty streets of Ouagadougou buzzed with an unusual tension on that sweltering September morning in 2022. Ambassador Laurent Dubois stepped out of his armored vehicle, adjusting his tie despite the oppressive heat that seemed to press down on the Burkinabe capital like a heavy blanket. The French diplomat had been serving in West Africa for over a decade, but something felt different about this assignment. The air itself seemed charged with anticipation and unrest. Dubois had arrived in Burkina Faso just 3 months earlier, tasked with managing France's delicate relationship with a nation increasingly skeptical of its former colonial power. His instructions from the Élysée Palace were clear but challenging: maintain French influence while navigating the growing, anti-French sentiment that was sweeping across the Sahel region. The diplomat prided himself on his ability to read political currents, but the situation in Burkina Faso was proving more complex than anything he had encountered in his previous postings in Senegal, Côte d'Ivoire, and Mali. The French embassy, compound with its high walls and manicured gardens, stood as a stark contrast to the bustling neighborhood surrounding it. Inside, Dubois reviewed intelligence reports that painted a concerning picture. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, a young military officer barely in his 30s, was gaining significant influence within the army ranks. The reports described him as charismatic, intelligent, and deeply committed to what he called true independence for Burkina Faso. What worried Dubois most was Traoré's growing criticism of foreign military presence, particularly the French forces stationed in the region under various cooperation agreements. Unlike other military leaders who had come and gone, Traoré seemed to have a clear vision for his country's future, one that didn't necessarily include France's traditional role as a guiding partner. The ambassador's morning briefing with his security chief, Colonel Marie Rousseau, revealed disturbing intelligence. Street protests against French presence were becoming more organized and frequent. Young Burkinabés, frustrated by ongoing security challenges and economic hardships, were increasingly blaming France for their country's problems. Social media, campaigns with hashtags like Car France Out and Ho Burkina First were gaining momentum, and many posts specifically praised Traoré's nationalist stance. Dubois understood that his mission went beyond traditional diplomacy. France had significant economic interest in Burkina Faso, particularly in mining operations that extracted gold and other valuable minerals. The uranium deposits in the northern regions were also crucial for France's nuclear energy program. Losing influence in Burkina Faso could trigger a domino effect across the Sahel, potentially costing France billions in lost contracts and strategic positioning. The diplomat's concerns deepened when he learned about Traoré's recent speeches to military units. Unlike the typical rhetoric of African military leaders, Traoré spoke with conviction about genuine sovereignty and economic independence. He questioned why Burkina Faso, rich in natural resources, remained one of the world's poorest countries despite decades of French partnership and development aid. Intelligence sources within the military reported that Traoré was building a coalition of young officers who shared his vision. These weren't opportunistic soldiers seeking personal gain, but idealistic patriots who genuinely believed that foreign influence was hindering their nation's progress. The movement was gaining support not just within the military, but among university, students, civil society organizations, and even some traditional chiefs. Dubois spent his afternoons meeting with various stakeholders, trying to gauge the political temperature. His conversations with government officials revealed a deep sense of uncertainty. Many admitted privately that change was inevitable, but they were unsure about what form it would take. Some expressed concern about Traoré's growing influence, while others seemed resigned to the possibility of another military intervention in politics. The French business community in Ouagadougou was increasingly nervous. Mining executives reported subtle changes in their interactions with local officials. Contracts that had been routine renewals were now facing unprecedented scrutiny. Local partners who had previously been reliable allies were beginning to distance themselves, apparently hedging their bets in case the political winds shifted dramatically. What struck Dubois as particularly significant was Traoré's approach to public communication. Unlike previous military leaders who relied on traditional media, Traoré understood the power of social media and direct engagement with the population. His messages resonated with young Burkinabés who felt disconnected from the political establishment and frustrated by the lack of meaningful change in their daily lives. The ambassador's evening reports to Paris reflected his growing concern about the rapidly evolving situation. The French government had invested heavily in maintaining stability in the Sahel region, both for strategic reasons and to combat terrorism threats that could eventually reach European shores. Losing Burkina Faso would not only represent a significant setback for French influence but could also create a security vacuum that would be difficult to fill. As September progressed, Dubois noticed subtle changes in how he was received during official functions. Conversations that had previously been warm and collaborative became more formal and guarded. Some officials who had been regular contacts began declining meetings or canceling appointments at short notice. The diplomatic community was beginning to sense that major changes were approaching. The ambassador's intelligence network reported increasing activity among military units across the country. Traoré was apparently conducting informal meetings with officers from various regions, building consensus around his vision for Burkina Faso's future. These weren't secretive conspiracy meetings, but open discussions about the country's direction and the role of the military in protecting national interests. Dubois realized that he was witnessing something unprecedented in his diplomatic career. This wasn't a typical African coup motivated by personal ambition or ethnic grievances. Instead, it appeared to be a genuine nationalist movement led by a young officer who had captured the imagination of his fellow citizens. The challenge for France was how to respond to this emerging reality while protecting its long-term interests in the region. The diplomat understood that the traditional playbook of African diplomacy might not be effective in dealing with Traoré and his movement. This new generation of African leaders seemed less impressed by France's historical role and more focused on practical results for their people. The coming weeks would test everything Dubois had learned about African politics and French diplomacy in the post-colonial era. The morning of September 28th brought news that would change everything for Ambassador Dubois and the French presence in Burkina Faso. Reports filtered through diplomatic channels that Captain Ibrahim Traoré had successfully orchestrated a military takeover, deposing the transitional government that had itself come to power through a coup earlier that year. What made this development particularly significant was not just the change in leadership, but the manner in which Traoré presented his actions to the Burkinabé people and the international community. Dubois watched from his office as crowds gathered in the streets of Ouagadougou, not in panic or fear but in celebration. Young people waved Burkinabé flags and carried signs supporting the new military leadership. The scenes were remarkably different from typical post-coup atmospheres in African capitals. Instead of uncertainty and apprehension, there was an unmistakable sense of hope and anticipation among the population. The new leader's first public address revealed the depth of planning behind the takeover. Traoré spoke directly to the Burkinabé people, explaining his movement's goals in terms that resonated with ordinary citizens. He talked about sovereignty, dignity, and the need for Burkina Faso to control its own destiny. Most concerning for Dubois was Traoré's pointed criticism of foreign military presence and what he termed exploitative economic relationships with former colonial powers. Intelligence reports reaching the French embassy painted a picture of a well-organized transition. Unlike chaotic coups that often involved violence and confusion, Traoré's takeover appeared methodical and strategic. Key military installations had been secured without bloodshed, and civilian infrastructure remained operational. The new leadership seemed determined to maintain stability while implementing their vision for change. What alarmed French officials most was Traoré's apparent immunity to traditional diplomatic pressure. Previous African leaders who had come to power through military means typically sought international legitimacy and were therefore amenable to negotiations and compromises. Traoré, however, seemed genuinely indifferent to Western approval. His legitimacy came from popular support and military backing, not from international recognition. Dubois attempted to establish communication channels with the new leadership but encountered unexpected obstacles. His usual contacts within the ADT, military and government were either unavailable or claimed they were no longer authorized to meet with foreign diplomats without explicit approval from the new command structure. This represented a significant departure from the informal access that French representatives had traditionally enjoyed in Burkina Faso. The economic implications of the political change became apparent within days of Traoré's takeover. French companies operating in the country reported difficulties accessing their facilities and communicating with local partners. Some mining operations were temporarily suspended, while the new government conducted what they termed audits of foreign economic activities. These reviews were described as necessary steps to ensure that Burkina Faso's natural resources were being exploited in ways that genuinely benefited the population. Traoré's public statements during his first weeks in power revealed a sophisticated understanding of international relations and economic policy. He spoke about the need for fair partnerships and mutually beneficial relationships, but made it clear that the era of unquestioning cooperation with former colonial powers was ending. The young leader demonstrated an impressive grasp of his country's economic data, pointing out discrepancies between the wealth of natural resources and the poverty of ordinary citizens. The French business community in Burkina Faso found themselves in an increasingly uncomfortable position. Many had built their operations on the assumption of continued French political influence and favorable government treatment. Now they faced the prospect of operating in an environment where being French might actually be a disadvantage rather than an asset. Some companies began quietly exploring partnerships with local businesses, hoping to demonstrate their commitment to Burkina Faso's development. Dubois received increasingly urgent communications from Paris, demanding detailed assessments of the situation and recommendations for response strategies. The French government was clearly caught off guard by the speed and effectiveness of Traoré's takeover. Traditional tools of influence, including economic leverage and diplomatic pressure, seemed inadequate to address this new reality. What made the situation particularly challenging was Traoré's communication strategy. He regularly addressed the nation through various media channels, explaining his government's policies and responding to criticism. These communications revealed a leader who was not only charismatic but also well-informed about international affairs and economic policy. He could articulate his vision for Burkina Faso in ways that made sense to both educated elites and ordinary citizens. The regional implications of Traoré's rise began to manifest as leaders from neighboring countries started expressing interest in his model of governance. Social media discussions across West Africa featured comparisons between Burkina Faso's new direction and the continued struggles of countries that maintained close ties with former colonial powers. This created concerns in Paris about a potential contagion effect across the Sahel region. Intelligence reports suggested that Traoré was not operating in isolation, but was part of a broader network of young African leaders who shared similar visions for their countries. These leaders maintained communication and apparently coordinated some of their strategies for reducing foreign influence while building genuine independence. The implications for French interests across the continent were potentially enormous. Dubois found himself in the difficult position of having to explain to Paris why traditional diplomatic approaches were proving ineffective. The new Burkina Faso leadership seemed genuinely uninterested in the carrots and sticks that had historically influenced African governments. They appeared willing to accept short-term economic difficulties in exchange for what they saw as long-term independence and dignity. The ambassador's analysis suggested that Traoré represented something new in African politics, a leader whose primary constituency was his own people rather than international partners. This fundamental shift in priorities made him less susceptible to external pressure, but also more dangerous to established international arrangements. The challenge for France was how to adapt to this new reality while protecting its strategic interests. As October began, Dubois realized that his mission in Burkina Faso had become far more complex than anyone in Paris had anticipated. The country was not simply experiencing another military coup, but was undergoing a fundamental transformation in its relationship with the outside world. The French diplomat knew that the decisions made in the coming weeks would have consequences that extended far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. The first direct confrontation between Ambassador Dubois and the new Burkina Faso leadership came in early October, during what was supposed to be a routine diplomatic meeting. Traoré had agreed to meet with foreign ambassadors, ostensibly to discuss the transition and reassure the international community about his government's intentions. However, the meeting quickly revealed the depth of the ideological chasm between the new Burkina Faso leadership and its traditional Western partners. Dubois arrived at the presidential palace expecting the kind of diplomatic dance that had characterized his interactions with African leaders throughout his career. Instead, he found himself face-to-face with a leader who seemed genuinely unimpressed by French diplomatic credentials and unwilling to engage in the usual pleasantries that typically preceded substantive discussions. Traoré's directness was both refreshing and unsettling for a diplomat accustomed to more indirect communication styles. The young captain, now styling himself as the head of state, began the meeting by presenting a detailed analysis of Burkina Faso's economic relationship with France over the previous decade. The presentation was thorough and well documented, showing patterns of resource extraction that provided minimal benefit to ordinary Burkinabés while generating substantial profits for French companies. Traoré's command of economic data and his ability to present complex information clearly demonstrated that this was not an impulsive leader, but someone who had carefully studied his country's situation. What struck Dubois most forcefully was Traoré's apparent lack of interest in maintaining the diplomatic niceties that typically characterize such meetings. The Burkina Faso leader asked pointed questions about French military operations in the region, demanding explanations for activities that had previously been conducted with minimal consultation with local governments. He questioned the effectiveness of French counterterrorism efforts and suggested that the continued presence of foreign military forces might actually be contributing to regional instability. The ambassador attempted to steer the conversation toward areas of mutual interest and cooperation, but Traoré seemed determined to address what he saw as fundamental inequalities in the France-Burkina Faso relationship. He spoke about the need for his country to develop its own security capabilities, rather than relying on foreign military support. This represented a direct challenge to the French strategy of maintaining influence through security partnerships and military cooperation agreements. Dubois found himself defending policies and arrangements that he had previously taken for granted. Traoré's questions were not hostile, but were uncomfortably penetrating. The Burkina Faso leader wanted to understand why his country, despite decades of French partnership and development assistance, remained among the world's poorest nations. He asked for specific examples of how French involvement had improved the lives of ordinary Burkinabés beyond the capital city. The meeting revealed the generational and ideological divide between the two leaders. Dubois represented a diplomatic establishment that viewed French involvement in Africa as generally beneficial, even if imperfect. Traoré embodied a new generation of African leaders who questioned the fundamental assumptions underlying post-colonial relationships. The young captain spoke about dignity and sovereignty in ways that suggested these were not abstract concepts but practical necessities for effective governance. As the discussion progressed, it became clear that Traoré had no intention of simply replacing one set of foreign partners with another. His vision for Burkina Faso's future emphasized self-reliance and regional cooperation, rather than dependence on external powers. This approach threatened not just French interests, but the entire framework of international relationships that had characterized the post-independence period in West Africa. The ambassador's attempts to highlight the risks of isolation and the benefits of continued partnership with France were met with polite but firm resistance. Traoré acknowledged that his country needed international relationships, but insisted that these should be based on equality and mutual benefit, rather than historical precedent and power imbalances. He seemed willing to accept short-term economic difficulties in exchange for what he saw as genuine independence. Dubois left the meeting with a clear understanding that traditional diplomatic approaches would be insufficient for managing the relationship with Traoré's government. The young leader was not seeking to renegotiate the terms of Burkina Faso's dependence on France, but was fundamentally rejecting dependence itself. This represented a challenge that went beyond diplomacy into questions of strategic positioning and long-term influence. The French embassy's assessment of the meeting painted a concerning picture for officials in Paris. Traoré appeared to have broad support within the military and significant popularity among young Burkinabés. His government's legitimacy did not depend on international recognition, which made traditional forms of pressure largely ineffective. The usual tools of diplomatic influence, including economic incentives and security partnerships, seemed inadequate for dealing with this new reality. Intelligence reports suggested that Traoré was not isolated in his thinking but was part of a broader movement of young African leaders who shared similar perspectives on sovereignty and self-determination. The implications for French policy across the continent were potentially enormous, particularly if other countries began adopting similar approaches to international relationships. The economic dimension of the confrontation became increasingly apparent as French companies reported growing difficulties in their operations. New government regulations required greater transparency in mining operations and mandated higher percentages of local employment and training. While these policies were presented as development initiatives, their practical effect was to reduce the profitability of French investments and increase operational complexity. Dubois realized that he was dealing with something unprecedented in his diplomatic career. Traoré was not simply another African leader seeking to maximize his country's benefits within existing international structures. Instead, he represented a fundamental challenge to those structures themselves. The young captain seemed genuinely committed to redefining Burkina Faso's place in the world, regardless of the opposition this might generate from traditional partners. The confrontation highlighted the broader crisis facing French policy in Africa. The assumption that former colonies would naturally gravitate toward partnership with France was being challenged by a new generation of leaders who viewed sovereignty and independence as practical necessities rather than abstract ideals. Traoré's rise represented not just a change in leadership, but a potential transformation in the entire basis of France-Africa relationships. As October progressed, it became clear that the meeting had marked a point of no return in the relationship between France and Burkina Faso. The diplomatic niceties that had previously masked underlying tensions were no longer sustainable. Both sides understood that they were engaged in a fundamental struggle over the future direction of one of Africa's most strategically important regions. The morning of November 15th began like any other for Ambassador Dubois, but it would end with him in custody and international headlines screaming about a diplomatic crisis between France and Burkina Faso. The events that led to his detention had been building for weeks, as tensions between the French embassy and Traoré's government escalated beyond the point where diplomatic protocols could contain them. The immediate trigger came from intelligence reports suggesting that French operatives were working to destabilize Traoré's government through covert operations designed to encourage military dissent. While such activities were not unusual in the context of African politics, Traoré's response would prove to be anything but conventional. Rather than lodge diplomatic protests or engage in behind-the-scenes negotiations, the Burkina Faso leader decided to confront French interference directly and publicly. Dubois was attending what he believed to be a routine meeting at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs when armed. Security personnel entered the conference room and informed him that he was being detained, pending investigation into activities inconsistent with his diplomatic status. The ambassador's initial reaction was incredulity, followed by anger at what he saw as a flagrant violation of diplomatic immunity and international law. However, the professionalism of the security personnel and the calm demeanor of Burkina Faso officials suggested that this was not an impulsive action, but a carefully planned operation. The detention facility where Dubois was held was not a prison, but a secure government building that had been prepared specifically for this purpose. His treatment, while firm, was respectful of his diplomatic status. He was provided with comfortable accommodations, access to communication with the French embassy, and regular meetings with Burkina Faso officials who explained the reasons for his detention. This careful approach suggested that Traoré understood the international implications of his actions and was prepared to defend them. The charges against Dubois centered on allegations that he had been coordinating activities designed to undermine Burkina Faso's sovereignty and interfere with its internal affairs. The Burkina Faso government presented evidence of communications between the French embassy and military officers who were allegedly plotting against Traoré's government. While Dubois denied any involvement in such activities, the evidence was sufficiently detailed to suggest extensive surveillance of French diplomatic activities. News of the ambassador's detention created immediate international headlines and prompted urgent diplomatic interventions from Paris. The French government demanded Dubois' immediate release and threatened serious consequences if he was not freed within hours. However, Traoré's response was measured and strategic. He used the international attention to highlight his government's concerns about foreign interference and to present his case for Burkina Faso's right to defend its sovereignty. The detention became a masterclass in political communication as Traoré used press conferences and media interviews to explain his government's actions to both domestic and international audiences. He presented detailed evidence of what he claimed was a pattern of French interference in Burkina Faso's internal affairs, including attempts to bribe military officers and influence political decisions. The young leader's articulate defense of his actions impressed many observers and complicated international efforts to condemn his government. What made the situation particularly challenging for French diplomats was Traoré's apparent willingness to accept the consequences of his actions. He seemed genuinely unconcerned about potential French retaliation or international condemnation. This suggested a level of confidence in his domestic support and strategic planning that caught many observers by surprise. The detention was not an impulsive act, but appeared to be part of a broader strategy to assert Burkina Faso's independence. Dubois found himself at the center of a diplomatic storm that extended far beyond his individual situation. His detention became a symbol of the changing power dynamics between France and its former colonies. African leaders across the continent watched carefully to see how France would respond and whether Traoré could successfully challenge French influence without facing devastating consequences. The French business community in Burkina Faso experienced immediate impacts from the diplomatic crisis. Several companies suspended operations pending resolution of the situation, while others began making contingency plans for potential evacuation. The detention sent a clear message that the traditional assumption of French diplomatic protection for business interests could no longer be taken for granted. International media coverage of the detention varied significantly depending on the source. French and European outlets generally presented Traoré's actions as dangerous violations of international law that threatened regional stability. However, African media and social media discussions often portrayed the detention as a justified response to colonial interference and an assertion of sovereignty that deserved support. The economic implications of the crisis became apparent within days as French companies reported increased difficulties in their operations. Some faced temporary suspensions of their licenses, while others encountered new regulatory requirements that had not existed before the detention. The message was clear. France could no longer assume that its economic interests would be automatically protected by diplomatic influence. Dubois' daily routine during detention included lengthy interviews with Burkina Faso investigators who presented evidence of French activities they claimed violated the country's sovereignty. While he maintained his innocence of any illegal activities, the ambassador was forced to confront the reality that his country's approach to Africa was facing unprecedented challenges from a new generation of leaders. The detention also revealed the limitations of French influence in contemporary Africa. Traditional responses to diplomatic crises, including economic threats and international pressure, proved largely ineffective against a leader who enjoyed genuine popular support and seemed willing to accept the costs of confronting foreign interference. Traoré's government actually appeared to gain domestic credibility from its willingness to stand up to France. As the detention continued, it became clear that this was not simply a diplomatic incident that could be resolved through traditional negotiations. Traoré was using Dubois' detention to make a broader point about sovereignty and independence that resonated throughout Africa and beyond. The young leader had calculated that the international attention generated by detaining a French ambassador would provide an unprecedented platform for articulating his vision of African independence. The crisis forced French policymakers to confront uncomfortable questions about their country's role in Africa and the sustainability of relationships, based on historical precedent rather than contemporary realities. Traoré's willingness to detain a French ambassador suggested that the era of unquestioned French influence in its former colonies was ending, replaced by a more complex and challenging international environment. The detention of Ambassador Dubois became a defining moment in the relationship between France and Burkina Faso, marking the point at which diplomatic tensions escalated into direct confrontation. The incident would have consequences that extended far beyond the immediate crisis, fundamentally altering how France approached its relationships with African countries and how African leaders viewed their obligations to former colonial powers. The international response to Ambassador Dubois' detention revealed the complex web of interests and relationships that characterize contemporary African politics. Within hours of the news breaking, the French Foreign Ministry issued strongly worded statements demanding the ambassador's immediate release and threatening serious consequences if Burkina Faso did not comply with international law regarding diplomatic immunity. However, the effectiveness of these traditional diplomatic tools would prove limited against a leader who seemed genuinely unconcerned about international condemnation. The European Union's response was swift but measured, reflecting the delicate balance its members sought to maintain between supporting France and avoiding escalation of the crisis. EU officials called for dialogue and respect for international law while stopping short of specific threats or sanctions. This relatively cautious approach suggested recognition that the situation in Burkina Faso represented broader challenges to European influence in Africa that could not be resolved through traditional diplomatic pressure. What surprised many observers was the muted response from other African leaders. Rather than condemning Traoré's actions as violations of diplomatic norms, several prominent African figures expressed understanding for Burkina Faso's concerns about foreign interference. The African Union issued a statement calling for dialogue and peaceful resolution, while notably avoiding explicit criticism of the detention. This response highlighted the growing sentiment across the continent that African countries should have greater control over their relationships with former colonial powers. The United States found itself in a particularly complex position, caught between supporting a NATO ally and avoiding actions that might be perceived as defending colonial-era relationships. American officials called for Dubois' release while emphasizing the importance of sovereignty and self-determination. This careful balancing act reflected Washington's own strategic interests in maintaining relationships with both France and emerging African leaders, who might play important roles in regional stability and counterterrorism efforts. Regional powers responded along predictable lines, with countries like Nigeria and Ghana calling for diplomatic solutions while avoiding explicit criticism of either side. However, some smaller West African nations expressed quiet support for Traoré's stance, viewing his actions as a necessary assertion of sovereignty that could inspire similar developments across the region. This division within the regional community complicated efforts to build international pressure for Dubois' release. The detention's impact on French business interests became immediately apparent as companies across sectors reported increased scrutiny from Burkina Faso authorities. Mining operations faced temporary suspensions while regulatory reviews were conducted, and several French firms reported difficulties accessing their facilities or communicating with local partners. The message was clear. France's traditional assumption that economic interests would be protected by diplomatic influence could no longer be taken for granted. Social media discussions across Africa revealed significant support for Traoré's actions, with many young Africans viewing the detention as a justified response to decades of French interference in African affairs. Hashtags supporting Burkina Faso's stance trended across multiple countries, suggesting that the incident had tapped into broader frustrations with post-colonial relationships. This digital activism complicated international efforts to portray Traoré's government as isolated or extremist. International media coverage varied dramatically depending on the outlet's perspective and target audience. French and European media generally portrayed the detention as a dangerous violation of international law that threatened regional stability. However, African media outlets and social media discussions often presented a more nuanced view, with many commentators arguing that Traoré's actions were justified responses to French interference in Burkina Faso's internal affairs. The economic implications of the crisis extended beyond bilateral France-Burkina Faso trade to broader questions about investment security in West Africa. International investors watched carefully to see how the situation would be resolved and what precedent it might set for other African countries seeking to assert greater control over foreign economic activities. Some analysts warned that the detention could signal a broader trend toward resource nationalism across the continent. Behind the scenes, intensive diplomatic efforts were underway to find a face-saving solution for all parties. French officials engaged in direct communications with Traoré's government while also working through intermediaries, including other African leaders and international organizations. However, these efforts were complicated by Traoré's apparent willingness to accept the consequences of his actions rather than seeking quick resolution of the crisis. The detention also highlighted the limitations of France's traditional tools of influence in contemporary Africa. Economic threats that might have been effective against previous generations of African leaders seemed to carry less weight with Traoré, who appeared willing to accept short-term economic costs in exchange for what he saw as genuine independence. Military intervention, while theoretically possible, would likely have catastrophic consequences for French interests across the region. International human rights organizations found themselves in an awkward position, torn between condemning the violation of diplomatic immunity and acknowledging legitimate concerns about foreign interference in African affairs. Some groups issued carefully worded statements calling for Dubois' release, while also urging greater transparency in international diplomatic activities. This nuanced approach reflected recognition that the situation involved complex questions about sovereignty and self-determination. The crisis forced international observers to confront uncomfortable questions about the sustainability of post-colonial relationships in Africa. Traoré's actions suggested that a new generation of African leaders was emerging who viewed sovereignty and independence as practical necessities rather than abstract ideals. These leaders seemed less impressed by traditional forms of international pressure and more focused on domestic legitimacy and popular support. Within France itself, the detention sparked intense debates about the country's Africa policy and its effectiveness in addressing contemporary challenges. Some critics argued that France's approach to Africa had failed to adapt to changing realities, and that the detention was a predictable consequence of policies that prioritized French interests over African development. However, supporters of traditional approaches warned that capitulating to Traoré's demands could encourage similar actions by other African leaders. The international response revealed the extent to which global power dynamics had shifted since the end of the Cold War. Traditional Western powers could no longer assume automatic support from African countries in disputes with individual African leaders. Instead, they faced a more complex international environment, where African countries increasingly pursued policies based on their own interests rather than historical relationships or external pressure. As days passed without resolution, it became clear that the detention represented more than a diplomatic incident between France and Burkina Faso. It had become a test case for the future of France-Africa relationships and a symbol of broader changes in global power dynamics. The international community watched carefully to see whether traditional diplomatic approaches would prove sufficient to resolve the crisis, or whether new forms of engagement would be required for dealing with Africa's emerging leaders. The complexity of the international response reflected the reality that simple solutions were unlikely to be effective in addressing the fundamental issues underlying the crisis. Traoré had succeeded in forcing the international community to confront questions about sovereignty, interference, and the legacy of colonialism that many preferred to avoid discussing directly. The resolution of Ambassador Dubois' detention came not through traditional diplomatic pressure, but through a carefully negotiated agreement that fundamentally transformed the relationship between France and Burkina Faso. After 3 weeks of intensive behind-the-scenes negotiations involving multiple intermediaries, including former South African President Thabo Mbeki and the Secretary-General of the African Union, both sides agreed to a framework that addressed the immediate crisis. while establishing new principles for future cooperation. Traoré's decision to release Dubois was conditional on several significant concessions from France, including formal acknowledgement that Burkina Faso had legitimate concerns about foreign interference in its internal affairs. The French government also agreed to review its military cooperation agreements and provide greater transparency in its economic activities within the country. These concessions represented a significant shift from France's traditional approach to such crises and demonstrated Traoré's skill in leveraging the detention for broader strategic objectives. The release ceremony itself was carefully choreographed to emphasize themes of mutual respect and sovereignty, rather than simply resolving a diplomatic incident. Traoré personally met with Dubois before his release, using the opportunity to articulate his vision for a new kind of relationship between African countries and their former colonial powers. The young leader's speech, broadcast live across Africa, emphasized partnership based on equality rather than historical precedent or power imbalances. Dubois' own reflections on his detention revealed the extent to which the experience had challenged his assumptions about African politics and French diplomacy. In private conversations with colleagues, the ambassador acknowledged that his 3 weeks in custody had provided unique insights into the depth of popular support for Traoré's nationalist agenda. He had witnessed firsthand the enthusiasm of ordinary Burkinabés for their young leader's vision of genuine independence and self-determination. The economic implications of the crisis and its resolution became apparent in the months following Dubois' release. Several French companies chose to restructure their operations in Burkina Faso, accepting greater local participation and transparency requirements in exchange for continued access to markets and resources. These changes, while costly in the short term, actually improved relations between French businesses and local communities in some cases. The broader regional impact of the Burkina Faso crisis was significant, as other African leaders took note of Traoré's successful challenge to French influence. Within months, similar discussions about sovereignty and foreign interference emerged in other West African countries, suggesting that the detention had catalyzed broader questioning of post-colonial relationships. Some leaders began demanding renegotiation of military cooperation agreements and greater transparency in economic partnerships with former colonial powers. The transformation of France's approach to Africa became evident in the policy changes that followed the crisis. French officials began engaging with African leaders differently, showing greater respect for sovereignty concerns and demonstrating willingness to negotiate partnerships based on mutual benefit rather than historical precedent. This shift represented a recognition that the old model of France-Africa relationships was no longer sustainable in the face of changing African expectations and global power dynamics. For Traoré himself, the successful resolution of the detention crisis significantly enhanced his domestic and international standing. His ability to secure concessions from France while maintaining stability in Burkina Faso impressed both supporters and critics. The young leader had demonstrated that it was possible for African countries to assert their sovereignty without descending into chaos or isolation. This success strengthened his position domestically and made him a respected voice in regional and continental discussions about Africa's future. The detention and its aftermath also had profound implications for diplomatic training and practices. The incident highlighted the need for diplomats to better understand the changing political dynamics in Africa and to develop new approaches for engaging with leaders who prioritized domestic legitimacy over international approval. Traditional diplomatic methods that had been effective during the Cold War era required significant adaptation for dealing with contemporary African politics. Dubois' own career trajectory was significantly affected by his experience in Burkina Faso. Rather than viewing the detention as a career setback, he used his unique insights to become a leading advocate within the French Foreign Ministry for more respectful and equitable approaches to African partnerships. His analysis of contemporary African politics, informed by his time in custody, influenced French policy development and helped prepare other diplomats for similar challenges. The economic landscape in Burkina Faso evolved considerably in the months following the crisis. New regulations requiring greater local participation in major projects initially created challenges for international investors, but ultimately led to more sustainable development approaches. Local employment increased, technology transfer became more common, and communities gained greater voice in decisions affecting their areas. These changes demonstrated that assertion of sovereignty could be compatible with economic development when properly managed. International academic and policy communities recognized the Burkina Faso crisis as a watershed moment in post-colonial African politics. Universities developed new curricula examining contemporary African leadership and the evolution of sovereignty concepts in the global South. Policy institutes organized conferences and published research exploring the implications of Traoré's approach for international relations theory and practice. The detention also influenced how other African leaders approached relationships with former colonial powers. Some adopted more assertive stances in their own negotiations, while others sought to learn from Traoré's methods without necessarily copying his tactics. The overall effect was to encourage more balanced and equal partnerships between African countries and their international partners, regardless of historical relationships. Social media discussions about the crisis continued long after Dubois' release, with many young Africans viewing Traoré's actions as inspirational examples of principled leadership. The hashtags and online conversations that emerged during the detention evolved into broader discussions about African development, sovereignty, and the continent's role in global affairs. These digital conversations helped sustain interest in questions of independence and self-determination across multiple countries. The resolution of the crisis demonstrated that diplomatic incidents, when handled skillfully, could become opportunities for positive transformation rather than simply problems to be solved. Traoré's approach showed that confrontation, when combined with clear communication and genuine commitment to principles, could lead to better relationships based on mutual respect rather than historical power imbalances. As the first anniversary of the detention approached, both France and Burkina Faso could point to concrete improvements in their relationship. Trade continued, but on more equitable terms. Military cooperation was restructured to better serve Burkina Faso's security needs. Development assistance became more transparent and participatory. These changes suggested that the crisis had ultimately strengthened rather than damaged the fundamental relationship between the two countries. The legacy of Ambassador Dubois' detention extended far beyond the immediate diplomatic crisis. It marked the emergence of a new generation of African leadership that was confident, articulate, and committed to genuine sovereignty. For France and other former colonial powers, it represented a necessary adaptation to contemporary African realities. The incident demonstrated that respect for sovereignty and equality could form the basis for stronger, more sustainable international partnerships than those based solely on historical precedent or economic leverage. Traoré's successful management of the crisis established him as a significant figure in contemporary African politics and a model for other leaders seeking to assert their country's independence while maintaining productive international relationships. The detention of a French ambassador had become a symbol of Africa's transformation and its growing confidence in charting its own course in global affairs.